Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World, the podcast that celebrates the remarkable women of the Viking Age. From fierce warriors and powerful queens to wise seers and cunning goddesses, these women left an indelible mark on history. Join authors Johanna Wittenberg and K.S. Barton each month as we explore the stories, achievements, and impact of Norse women. Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World. This is episode 15, in which Johanna and I discuss the Norse goddesses. We've talked about goddesses in passing in other episodes, and we've mentioned Freya on more than one occasion because she is the most prominent goddess in Norse mythology. There are more stories about her and with her in them than any other goddess, but there are many more goddesses to talk about. This is part one of two, because as Johanna and I were doing our research, we realized that it would be too much for one episode. Often when we think of Norse mythology goddesses, we only think of the major ones like Freya and Frigg, but not only are there many more of the Aesir and Vanir goddesses, we decided to include the Jotun women as well, who we've also discussed in previous episodes. So we have a lot. I'm K.S. Barton, author of the Norse Family Trilogy, the story of a young woman and a young Viking warrior caught in the middle of a deadly blood feud. And with me is Johanna Wittenberg. Hi, Johanna.
Good morning. I'm Johanna Wittenberg. I'm the author of the Norse Women series, which is the story of Queen Åsa, who was a real Viking age queen who ruled alone for 20 years. So take it away.
All right. First, we're going to give a little background about these different races of deities. So the Norse mythology deities are divided into different groups. We have the Aesir gods, which is what most people are familiar with. That's Odin and Thor and Freya. Well, take that back.
Frigg.
Frigg. We have the Vanir, and that's Freya and her brother Freyr, Njord, and some others. And then there are the Jotun, and then we have the elves and the dwarves. And the Aesir and the Vanir seem to be more like different family groups than a different race of beings. Like the dwarves and the elves seem to be a little different beings. They have their own places to live and everything. And then the Jotun seem to be mostly similar to the Aesir and the Vanir. And despite the translation of Jotun as giant, the Jotun are not always giants in stature. They're simply another group of supernatural beings.
And very powerful.
And very powerful, yes. They're certainly powerful enough to challenge the Aesir gods. In the Aesir, they intermarry and have relationships with the Jotunar, mostly Aesir gods and Jotun women, and they have children together. So Thor is the son of Odin and a Jotun woman. Frey has a Jotun wife and they have a child. And then Loki himself is a Jotun and was made an honorary member of the Aesir because of Odin's fondness for him.
Yes, they became blood brothers, and I don't remember that story exactly, but there is a story about it.
Yeah, and wasn't part of that story that Odin would never drink wine without Loki in the room?
It was something like that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever read about the blood brother ceremony? Like how they actually did it?
No.
Oh, I had to research it for a story of mine because two of my important characters were blood brothers. So I looked it up, and they will cut a square in the sod in the ground, and then they'll lift it up. They'll keep it like in one piece. How they do that, I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. They'll lift it up in one piece and like erect it with stakes in the ground. So it's like a canopy above them. And then the two men who are to become blood brothers will cut themselves, and they'll rub that blood together, and then it will drip into the ground, into the earth. And then they'll take that sod and they'll put it back, and I guess it grows back. And so it's like their blood connection is literally like soaking into the ground.
Wow.
Isn't that cool?
That's amazing.
Yeah. I'm just constantly like, that. I just always wonder, like, how do they keep that big piece of sod up? But maybe they
were very skillful farmers, remember?
That's true. That's true.
We couldn't do it, I don't think.
Yeah. Maybe that's the way the soil is.
Yeah.
You know, where they wrote the story is particularly like a clay or something. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that was a little digression, but even with all the intermarrying between the Aesir and the Jotun, they seem to be mortal enemies.
Yeah, they really do.
So there are some stories where Jotun are giants or much, much bigger than the Aesir gods, like in the tale of Thor and Utgard Loki. So Utgard Loki and his people, they were actually giant. They were much bigger than Thor. They were much stronger and everything. But then there's another story, but for the most part, the Jotun seem to be similar in stature to the other gods.
Well, yeah, because if they're that big, how would they breed
I know,
with the Aesir? I mean, they couldn't be that much bigger.
Exactly.
It's not physically possible.
Right. And as we were, at least as I was digging deeper, and I had to do a lot of research before we started. I started writing my books, but Norse mythology can be confusing because we have all these little bits and pieces. We have these old stories and poems, and then the rest of what we know comes from the 1200s, and that was at least 2 centuries after the Scandinavians converted to Christianity. So there had to have been a lot lost.
And the translations, even the modern translations, I was looking at some of the translations of the Eddas, and they just said whatever they felt like. They're not direct translations of Old Norse. So in many cases.
And that's why there's a lot of inconsistencies and even questions about whether certain goddesses or gods were all the same person or they were different at some point and then combined or what. I mean, there's, as we've talked about a lot, there's a lot of questions and a lot of mysteries because this was a long time ago.
Yeah, and historians and archaeologists have in the past really been free to make up their crazy theories that don't make any sense and aren't based on any facts too. So
yeah, even the idea that there was like this pantheon of these gods seems like it was, and some of the stories seem like a Christian overlay on them. Like we have to, everything has to be categorized in a way that I don't think they probably did it in the original time period.
And so much was trying to relate them exactly to the Greek and Roman gods as well. Was not necessarily the case. Odin and Zeus don't have that much in common.
Right.
A little bit, but not a lot.
Yeah, at least Odin wasn't coming down to earth and sleeping with every woman he encountered.
Only when they had mead that he wanted.
And usually there was some kind of condition.
Yes, there was a good reason. He had a good reason for it.
So in the beginning, speaking of more like Christian speak, in the beginning, the 2 families of gods, the Aesir and the Vanir, they were enemies. Well, actually, now that I read that out loud, I'm thinking, were they always enemies? We get this, or did that happen after? So at some point, things turned ugly around. There were some interactions with the goddess named Gulveig, whom Johanna will talk about in a little later. It's not clear what exactly transpired.
No.
She was staying with the Aesir gods and goddesses, so something happened, and it's not clear whether she caused it, they caused it, what happened. Things got a little ugly, and the 2 factions went to war.
Yes, and I'll read you that poem, and you can kind of decide for yourself. One of the many, many translations.
So Odin did his thing where he threw his spear into the fray, and that is something that Viking kings and warlords did in real life, where when they would see like an oncoming army, they would throw their spear over the heads of the enemy army and dedicate their win or whatever to Odin.
And the success of their throw kind of foretold the success of the battle.
Ah, that's right.
Supposedly. So they say. It's very colorful.
Yeah.
We don't know for sure that it's true, but it's mentioned.
I bet it's the winners are like, well, yeah, we knew he was going to win because his spear flew too far. So when it turned into a very ugly war, Thor, of course, was in the thick of things and enjoying himself. And the Aesir gods were more about physical combat, while the Vanir knew war magic.
Mm-hmm.
But war magic is I've never seen it explained, like what exactly that might be. I think it'd be fun to know.
It would.
And it went on for a long time until both parties grew weary of it. And then also, like in the real world and real medieval battles, it ended with the exchange of hostages. So the Aesir gods sent Mimir and Heinir to stay with the Vanir, while the Vanir gave up the god Njord and his twin children, Freya and Freyr, who then lived in Asgard with the Aesir gods. And despite being hostages, Freya and Freyr became very important in the Norse world. Two of the most important deities around.
And most frequently mentioned.
Yeah, especially Freya. She's in so many stories.
She really is. So with Freya, that brings us to Gullveig. And she's mentioned only in the Voluspa in the Poetic Edda. And it's a document that was compiled in the 13th century, early 13th century by Snorri Sturluson. It was based on earlier traditional material that we don't have. Scholars have proposed that Gullveig is Freya, and that we'll see when I read you the poem, and that Gullveig's treatment by the Aesir may have started the war between the Aesir and the Vanir. Now, when I read you the poem, you'll see that there are some clues that really make that likely, but they're a little vague. So the name Gullveig means gold, and veig is something that is a little bit, people are a little bit confused about. So some people think it means power or strength, which is like the Icelandic word veig, V-E-I-G, and that's probably the correct translation. But for some reason, scholars have gone with intoxicating drink, which is the Norwegian vegja, or possibly lady, Norwegian vega. So I go with the Icelandic since Old Icelandic is the closest to Old Norse. I would say we're talking about power of gold or gold power.
Well, lady isn't totally, it makes sense too. Like she's a gold lady, a powerful gold lady. Yeah.
It does make sense, and we've got many, many words with women's names that end in veig. Ranveig, Solveig, Thorveig. And so what does that mean? Well, hild means battle. So, it could mean power or strength. It could also mean lady, as you say. And that could mean, golden lady, woman of gold. I'll read you the poem and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. So this is just a translation that's by Carolyn Larrington. It's not particularly recent, but it's pretty accurate in many ways. So
she's well respected too.
She's very well respected. It starts out in verse 21 of the Voluspa. She remembers the first war in the world when they buttressed Gullveig with spears, and that's pretty accurate. And in One Eye's hall, they burned her, One Eye being Har, or another name for Odin. 3 times they burned her. 3 times she was reborn. Over and over, yet she lives still. Bright One, or Hyde, they called her, whenever she came to the houses. The seer with pleasing prophecies, she charmed them with spells. She made magic wherever she could. With magic, she played with minds. And she was always the favorite of wicked women. Then it goes on, and this is where some of the other hints come in. Then all the powers went to the thrones of fate, the sacrosanct gods, and considered this, whether the Aesir should yield the tribute or whether all the gods should partake in the sacrifices. Odin shot a spear, hurled it over the host, and that was still the first war in the world. The defensive wall was broken of the Aesir's stronghold. The Vanir, indomitable, were trampling the plain. Then all the powers went to the thrones of fate with the sacrosanct gods and considered this, who had mixed the air with wickedness, or given Odd's girl to the giant race. So Odd's girl is Freya. Freya's husband is Odd. And the giant race. So they gave Freya to the Jotuns. I don't know. Then it goes on. Thor alone struck a blow here, swollen with rage. He seldom sits still when he hears such things said. The oaths broke apart, the worlds and promises, all the solemn pledges which had passed between. So I'll stop there. It goes on, but they're saying that after she'd been burned 3 times, Gulvig becomes Bright One, or Hyde, which means bright. And they called her that whenever she came to the houses. So whenever she came among humans. And she was a seer with pleasing prophecies. So she's doing, and then they say, safe she practiced, and this with magic she played with minds. That doesn't translate. It's actually Gandar, which is wand magic. So they're talking about her using her wand, and she knew, essentially it's just saying she knew how to practice Sather. And then it says she was always the favorite of wicked women. That's kind of a strange translation too.
Unless it means witches.
Well, that's what I think it does. And whether this is some kind of a Christianized translation or whether the Vikings really thought that they were wicked, I don't know. But it's Ilyar, which is wicked or evil, and Brudar, which is translated as brides in many cases. Anyway, it goes on to talk about that the Aesir meet and they decide whether they should fight or whether they should surrender and make peace. Odin shoots his spear, so he says, let's go to war. And they fight. But then they talk about who had mixed the air with wickedness or given Odd's girl to the giant race. That's a kind of a crazy thing. So but it tells you that we're talking about Freya here. It definitely tells us that. And that she was transformed. And that's how she learned or gained her magic. So it's still very obscure, but it's got a little bit more clarity.
And so at the beginning, they
buttressed
her. That makes me feel like they're torturing her almost.
No, the word
they're spears?
They're not piercing her. I think what they're trying to say is that they surrounded her with spears so that she couldn't escape. Because then they burned her. But I don't know.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different translations. They say buttressed her. They say they stabbed her. The word itself in Old Norse is studu, Studdu. And so that's studded with, it's not. So the translation of the words are a little confusing just because they're not our common. They don't translate into common words. And it's such an ancient language that how do you go that far back and know what they're really saying definitively?
Well, yeah. And also these were poets we're talking about too. Yeah. So they would have used language in a different way. They're not trying to make it make a lot of sense. They're trying to make it sound beautiful or interesting or whatever they're playing.
To their rules.
Right. So there's that to contend with. That's another reason that makes it hard to figure things out is these poets using those kennings or something, or just like you said, they're trying to fix some kind of rule. So, okay, I'll choose this word. Or maybe it was alliterative and they liked alliteration.
Right.
So there's a lot of reasons to choose a word. I don't know if you've ever written poetry. I find poetry very difficult, but you really can get just fixated on, like, I have to find this one word.
Yes. Well, and so like Odin's girl, or that is definitely Freya. It's a kenning for Freya. So you can pretty much assume that Hyde is Freya, and that that this is what started the war. Now, whether we don't have the beginning of the story, we don't, as you mentioned, we don't know why she showed up in the Aesir's hall or fortress, but we do know they burned her and she survived it 3 times, and she went through this ritual of fire. and survived, and then she became very powerful. She became a powerful seeress. So the word vulva does mean wand bearer, someone who carries a staff or a wand. And so it would make sense. And Gonder is a word for staff or wand. And so it makes sense that that would be, and they talk about Seith, which is, the magic that vulvas practice. So this seems to tell us that this is how Freya became a practitioner, a master of Seithr, and that it involved wands, but it doesn't tell us how. And that women were particularly involved in this. And then it goes on to talk about, the war, and that this is what started the war. It really kind of says that, pretty much says that. And then, it says that it identifies her as Freya. So, but how she was given to the Jotnar, I don't know. That's another mystery. It's not explained anywhere in that poem.
And does that mean that Od was a Jotun?
Maybe. We don't know because he's not really explained anywhere. He's just only identified as her husband.
Yeah.
Some people think he's Odin, but Odin was not a Jotun.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah.
Just because the names have the same root doesn't mean it's the same person. I don't know. More questions than answers, but it's an interesting investigation into that poem. So now tell us some more about Freya.
Okay, so now I have to pause for a moment because that was really cool. See, one of the things that I often don't read, Johanna and I have notes that we take of this, but I often don't read hers because I like to be surprised by what she's going to say. I do. I kind of like to be like, oh, that's really interesting because I love that idea of her being burned 3 times and then becoming something even more powerful. That's so cool. I guess that's the writer brain in me going, wow.
It's very Norse.
Yeah.
She survived it. It's like that old saying that what doesn't kill you will make you stronger.
Yeah.
Well, this is really a living, so to speak, living proof of this. But then supposedly her name changed to Bright One, but there are also some scholars that say, well, Bright One and gold, they're
they
kind
go
of
together,
synonymous, but they're not synonymous, but they're similar. And also even some have suggested that maybe they're talking about smelting gold and the purification.
Oh, huh.
Who knows? Well, and of course, as you'll tell us later, Freya is very much identified with gold.
Oh yeah,
she really is in many ways. There's a lot of different little things. So you'll get into that, I know, because you've got that in your.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe the poets even left ambiguity on purpose because they wanted people to keep talking about what they heard.
Sure.
Kind of like writers now, we leave a little mystery, like, oh, what happened? Yeah. Maybe they wanted to leave their listeners talking about it the next day, going, oh, what happened with Goveg? Was she,
It wouldn't surprise me.
No. What else did they have to do other than work and
kill each other? Loot and murder.
Yeah. So that brings us to Freya. And other than Odin, Thor, and Loki, she is the deity mentioned the most in the stories. And she's probably one of the greatest of all of them in the Norse pantheon. As we mentioned, her name means lady, and her brother Freyr's name means lord. She's one of the Vanir. Her father is Njord, the god of the sea, and we'll hear about him a little later. And her hall is called Folkvanger, which means an army plain or an army meadow or something like that. And this is according to Snorri in the Prose Edda, that Freya is easily approachable to those who pray to her, and it is good to call on her in matters of love. I'm not so sure about that, but maybe lust or sex or war, but love. Anyway, so that's most likely where we get the idea that she's the Norse goddess of love.
Which isn't totally true.
Didn't really fit her. Everybody loved her or lusted after her, or that may be Loki. And several of the Jotnar were in love with her or in lust with her. and they tried to trick their way into getting her in their possession. She was twice, or I can think of two times where she was bartered as a prize.
At least, yes.
Once when Thor lost his hammer and
Yeah.
they had to get it back from him, from a jotun who said he'd return it if Freya married him.
Yes.
And then that's one of my favorite stories.
Mhm.
And then the other time was when the disguised Jotun offered to build a wall around Asgard and demanded Freya as his payment.
Yes. I
Both
think it was
times.
the sun, the moon, the stars, and Freya.
That's right. Poor Freya. They were always like, sure, you can marry her. And then they had to get out of it somehow. And the dwarves had a thing for her too.
Yes.
She was openly sexual and not apologetic about it. And that's another reason why she's often mentioned as a goddess of love and lust. And she slept with 4 dwarves, one on each night, in order to obtain her famous necklace, Brisingamen. And in the poem Lokasenna, Loki slut shames her and accuses her of sleeping with all of the gods, including her own brother. Yeah. So he says, silence, Freya, you are not free from faults. I know you too well. You've played the whore with every god and every elf who sits in this hall. She never apologizes for it. Nobody even really bats an eye at the accusation. But I noticed as I was reading that they made a mention that the elves were there in the hall with them. So the elves, we don't know much about them, but every now and then there'll be a little thing like that, like every god and every elf in the hall. So that means there were elves in attendance at this huge feast.
Well, and they talk about Freyr as being the Lord of the elves.
That's right.
We're talking about the light elves, the Leos. I can't say it.
Leos.
Yeah. There you go. Alpha, and so he's mentioned that way a few times, and that's right. Brother. So they may be minor deities, and we don't even know if some of these goddesses that we'll mention later, they could be elves.
Oh, yeah. I never thought about it that way.
They have their own place. They're not as high up as the Aesir, but are they related? We don't know. Yeah. It's not ever made clear.
No. I always wondered if all the slut shaming in the Lokasenna came from the Christians who wrote it down, or if it was a thing from the Viking times. But
I think there was an awful lot of things added during the Christian era when these things were written down.
Yeah. So as Johanna mentioned, Freya had a husband named Od, by whom they have a daughter named, and I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this right, Hnoss. Hnoss. Hnoss.
That's very good.
And her name means treasure, but not much else is known about her. And I kind of wonder, I'm like, is she named Treasure because she's like golden, like Gullveig, or is she just a treasured daughter, or what?
It's really a good question.
Yeah. So Freya's husband Od left the realm of the gods to travel all over the world, and no one knew why he left or where he went, or at least we don't know where he went. And Freya searched for him throughout all the 9 worlds of the Norse mythology world, and she used different names to disguise herself, but she never found him. And every night she cried tears of red gold or amber. In the Norse, sometimes called amber, Freya's tears. I love that kenning. It's one of my favorite. I just love the color of amber, and to call it Freya's tears, it's just really beautiful.
It is.
So on a little bit of a side note, I've done this before. Like I often think of other mythologies. So this story of a goddess wandering the world in search of her husband is reminiscent of the Egyptian tale of the goddess Isis and her husband, the god Osiris. Have you heard that tale before?
Yes.
Yeah. So he was a king whose brother was jealous of him. I mean, isn't it always the brother who's, I mean, even the Lion King had a jealous brother. So Seth killed Osiris, and he did it by tricking him. He tricked him into a coffin, then he sealed him up and he threw him into the Nile. Isis found
Osiris couldn't have been the sharpest tack in the
It was one of those deals coffin. Like, I know, like get in this coffin. It fits you perfectly.
Almost like it was made for you.
Luckily for Osiris, Iris found his body, but she had to kind of leave him. She needed to go get help from some other goddesses and to get what she needed to do a rite to bring him back. And while she was gone, Seth found the body, and to keep Isis from doing anything else, he cut Osiris into 14 pieces and flung them throughout Egypt.
Wow.
Yeah. So Isis transformed into a bird, probably a falcon, and
Probably.
flew over Egypt to find Osiris's pieces. She did. And then with the help of some other magical goddesses, they sewed him back together and he came back to life. Well, they did some other magical, ritual to bring him back to life. But because he was dead, he couldn't live in the living world again. So he became the god of the underworld. And then their son Horus eventually avenged his father, which is also very common.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then there's also one more side detour. It also reminds me of the story of Demeter in Greek mythology, only instead of searching for her husband, she's searching for her daughter Persephone, who had been kidnapped by the god Hades and taken to the underworld. So I can see why these stories would be popular, especially maybe among women, like this idea of searching for your lost husband or your lost daughter, even symbolically. And then like in these stories, at least with Osiris and Persephone, bringing them back, finding them and bringing them back and restoring them. Freya never, at least we don't have any evidence that she found him. Maybe in some stories she did, but I could see finding some comfort in these stories.
Well, and Freya does an awful lot of other things besides searching for her lost husband. But
True.
There are some theories that all of these myths come from a very common, Indo-European root. And that's why there's similarities between all these different myths. And yet they've been changed by whatever culture they're told in.
Mm.
And so that these myths go back, to the time when they were migrating across Europe.
Yeah. And I'm not very familiar with Asian mythology or, South American or what to know if they have some stories that are similar.
A lot of them are coming from India and from Hindu myths.
Mm-hmm.
And I've read quite a few similarities in there where those could be the roots of these, even the Nordic myths.
Yeah.
But
so
I'm not going to go into that.
Yeah, but it's just interesting to see those. I love those connections.
Yes.
I studied a lot of like comparative mythology and comparative literature when I was in school. So I'm like constantly making these connections. So Freya had some other names that she went by. They have Mardul, which I can't remember where that's from. Horn, Geffen, and Syr, Syr.
Must be Syr.
Syr. She travels in a chariot pulled by two cats, which I love. But unfortunately, we don't know their names or anything about them, really. So, and cats in the Norse world were not like what we imagine a domestic house cat to look. They were probably much more like a Norwegian forest cat or like a Maine Coon cat. They would have been large, shaggy, kind of brawny cats.
And beautiful cats.
Yeah.
And a couple other little tidbits. One of them is that when a woman is married, she is given a kitten in honor of Freya. And also the back of the cart in the Oseberg burial ship, there's the cart that's very old. It's much older than the ship. And it has on the very back of it, it has all these cats carved on it.
Oh, cool.
And many of them are weeping. They're crying. So we don't know why. We don't know anything about these cats, but it's just covered with many, many cats. And like I said, some of them are crying. They're wiping their eyes.
Oh, interesting.
The story. There's several stories on this Oseberg cart that we don't know that involve women. And so they think it's a very old cart that was used in ceremonies by a representative of Freya, possibly.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. I didn't know that about a groom giving the bride a kitten.
Yeah.
And in one of my stories, my main male character gives his new wife a kitten. I didn't know about this because she had a cat, and when she went to live with him in his home, he figured she might be missing her cat, so he gave her a kitten. I didn't know that there was a
It was a thing.
I didn't know what to say. I must have been
Must
channeling
have
that.
been. It's in your blood.
I guess so.
Absorbed more than you think you have.
That's true. And in another story, she rode a boar named Hildisvini, which means battle swine.
Mhm.
And this was a man named Otar. He was in disguise. So he was a worshiper of Freya. So when he wanted to learn more about his ancestors, she disguised him as this boar and rode him to visit Osiris, who could then tell him what he needed to know. I'm
And
sure he was.
she was a dead seeress.
That's
They're all
right.
dead,
Yeah.
seems like.
She owned a cloak made from falcon feathers, Fjardarhammer. And we
Which
talked
means
about
feathers skin. It means feathers skin or skin of feather.
right. Yeah, we talked about the hammer in the May episode. So
Right.
if you haven't listened to that yet, go check that one out. It's got some cool stuff about the different parts of the Viking spirit. And this falcon cloak allows the wearer to fly. And in one story, Loki borrows it so he can fly to Jotunheim. We'll hear this story in a little bit.
As usual, he's in trouble.
He causes the trouble.
He does.
And then he has to fix it.
Yep.
So, and she claims half of all fallen warriors slain in battle. And she is also believed to be the leader of the Valkyries. So,
And many of the goddesses that are mentioned, as well as the Nornir, are also mentioned as Valkyries. So it's like they had a dual role.
like air and yeah.
Yeah.
And personally, I love it that Freya is a goddess known for her sexual appetites and also is the head of the Valkyries and chooses these fallen warriors. I love that dual nature of her.
Yes. As well
as magic. Yes. As Johanna said earlier, she's well versed in the magic of Saith. She brought that magic to the Aesir gods, and she even taught it to Odin. And then Loki, it should just be called the poem where Loki behaves badly. He shamed Odin about his knowledge of magic, saying it was unseemly for a man to practice it. Saith was pretty much only for women.
And that was true in Norse culture as well.
Yeah.
There's a story about Harold Fairhair putting one of his sons to death along with his followers because he practiced Sather.
Wow, that's pretty brutal. His own son.
It's very brutal. And the way they were killed, they were chained down at high tide on the skerries, so that at low tide, so the tide came over them and drowned them. But it's pretty gruesome.
Yeah. And then Freya's most prized possession was the necklace Brisingamen. And the word means like a fire torque or an amber torque. And that could be another connection between Golvig and Freya and that connection to gold. Her Freya's tears were gold or amber. This torque is gold or amber color. At any rate, the necklace was made out of gold. And like most of the Norse gods' prized possessions and weapons, like Odin's spear and Thor's hammer, the dwarves created Brisingamen. And like we said, she slept with 4 different dwarves to get that necklace.
And Loki stole it.
And then Loki stole it.
Along with a lot of other things that the dwarves made.
Yeah. And I kind of like it. As far as we know, there's nothing magical about Brisingamen, but it's just very beautiful. And I kind of like it that it's not magical, that it's so well valued because of its beauty. And I like it because, we have this version of Vikings and even medieval people in general as just ugly and dirty and grimy and bloody, but they were also
that was not true at all.
Artists and craftspeople. They created like beautiful things. So I love it that Brisingamen, one of their myths, has this necklace that's prized simply for its beauty.
Even their clothing was beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
There's they had some fragments of clothing in the Oseberg burial ship, and they show that the seams were actually embroidered with little flowers, tiny embroidery.
Neat. All right. Have anything else about Freya?
No, not that I can think of. I think you pretty well covered it.
And then there's Frigg. She's the wife of Odin, and Sturluson called her the foremost. But there's not much we know about her. You'd think that if she was the foremost among the goddesses, we'd have more stories about her, but she's just not in them much. We do know that she can see the future, but she refuses to say anything about it. And this makes me think of the Greek story of Cassandra. She was a Trojan priestess who was devoted to the god Apollo. He gave her the gift of prophecy, but when he grew angry with her, he couldn't take that gift away because you can't take away a gift already given. So he made it so no one would believe her prophecies.
That's
She
very
warned,
tricky.
yeah. So she warned the Trojans about the Greeks bearing gifts, but they ignored her and they suffered the consequences.
Boy,
So
did
I'm thinking maybe Frigg was smart enough to keep her knowledge of the future to herself.
they. Yeah.
And even like I was just reading the other day about a woman in, oh, I can't remember. She was in Spain. It was during the Inquisition, and she had a vision of the future where the Spanish Armada was defeated by the English, and they threw her in a dungeon and stuff. And it's just like, yeah, women who speak about the future often get in trouble. So maybe Frigg was smart enough to be like, I'm not saying anything. And she was also insulted by Loki at that terrible feast. He accuses her of sleeping with both of Odin's brothers, Vili and Ve.
And she doesn't seem too put out by that either.
No, nobody does. Odin doesn't like come
So
to her
what?
defense. Nobody's like, oh, you shouldn't talk about her, you know.
And they don't say it's not true either.
No. The same with Freya when they were like, yeah, you slept with everybody, even your brother. Nobody denies it. She doesn't deny it. And we've touched on it a little bit about there's some speculation that maybe Freya and Frigg were at one point early on, maybe the same goddess, and they were separated. We talked about Frigg being married to Odin, Freya being married to Od, but Od roamed the world, wore disguises. Odin did that, but who knows? But in the Lokasena, they are clearly separate goddesses because Loki insults them both separately.
Separately, yes. They each get their own special treatment.
Yeah. So that's just one of those mysteries.
Yes. Well, and Frigg was the mother of Balder. And so in Balder's dream, she goes to all the creatures because Odin had gone and questioned a sorceress to find out why Balder was having these nightmares. And she told him that he was going to be killed. So Frigg went to all the creatures in the world and made them swear not to harm her son. But she overlooked the mistletoe, thinking it was too young to swear an oath and that it was harmless. But of course, Loki found a way to bring around Balder's downfall using this mistletoe.
All right. And then our word for Friday comes from the Old English, or it's confusing because it's Friggadag. So it sounds like Frigg's Day, but it's often also translated as Freya's Day. The Old Norse word for that is Friadagar. So I don't know. So who knows if it's
for
actually
both of them. It could actually
it could, yeah. Just maybe it's just like a goddess day.
Yeah, or a lady's day.
Lady day, yeah.
Because Freya does mean lady.
Yeah. Yeah. So Friday could just be Ladies' Day.
Mm-hmm.
We're recording this on Thor's Day, though. we should have recorded on Ladies' Day. Next, we have Loki's wife, the goddess Sigyn. And some people might not even realize that Loki has a wife, because we have often talked about him in terms of the mother of his children, the Jotun Angerboda, but Sigyn, the wife, doesn't get mentioned much except in one story.
And she is a Aesir goddess.
That's right. After Loki killed the beloved god Balder, the gods chased him down. He had transformed himself into a salmon and he was hiding in some water. They caught him and they bound him up with the intestines of one of his sons.
Oh.
I know, it's so gross. To make it even worse, the goddess Skadi, who Loki had insulted by accusing her of wanting to sleep with him, tied a serpent over Loki's head. And that serpent continuously drips venom into Loki's eyes. So we're going to meet Skadi later. She's pretty cool.
Yes.
So Sigyn stood by her husband and she held a bowl over his face to catch the poison before it landed in his eyes. But of course, that bowl's going to fill up. And after a while, Sigyn has to empty it. When she does, the poison drips again onto Loki's face. It's incredibly painful. So Loki thrashes on the rock and he makes a lot of noise. And when this happens, the world shakes and trembles. And that's why we have earthquakes.
Of course
So
it is.
that's basically Sigyn. She's just there to catch the poison that drips onto Loki's face.
As far as we know. Anyway.
As far as we know. Yeah, we don't know how she met, how they met or married or if she has any powers or anything.
So as mentioned, Loki had another woman. Her name was Angerboda, and she was a jotun, which Loki was also. We don't really know if he had known her before he became an Aesir blood brother, but they had 3 children, and all of them were monstrous children. So there was 2 sons. One of them was Fenrir the wolf. The other was Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, who stretches all around the ocean, all around the world, and chews his own tail. So I guess the Vikings probably knew that the world was round.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Good point.
because he circumnavigates. Anyway, those 2 also had a sister, and her name was Hel. And she was supposedly half dead and half alive, or half black and half white. It sounds like she was part corpse and part living woman. So when these children were born, the gods were very much afraid of them because they were monstrous. And they sneaked in to Jotunheim and went to Angerboda's hall when she was gone. And they kidnapped these 3 children. Obviously, they were pretty small then because they could manage him. And they cast Jormungandr into the ocean, where he circumnavigates the globe and bites his tail. And Fenrir, the wolf, they bind with magical fetters. And that whole story is very interesting because they have to trick him. He keeps, he breaks every chain that they bind him with. And this makes him more and more fearful. Well, while he was in captivity, Tyr, the god of war, was actually made friends with him, and he came to kind of trust him. So they go and they get this fetter that's made out of things like the sound of a cat's footfall and a woman's beard. It's a very magical chain, but it looks like just a little lightweight ribbon. And they ask Fenrir if they can tie him up with that. And he says, I don't know about that. I tell you what, if Tyr puts his hand in my mouth, then I'll let you do it. So Tyr puts his hand in Fenrir's
His right
mouth.
hand.
Yes, his right hand. And they tie it, the rope has a name, and I don't remember the name of it, but they tie him with it, and he can't break it. So he bites Tyr's hand off, his right hand, as you said, his sword hand.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite a handicap for the god of war. But anyway, they take Hel, the daughter, and Odin casts her into the underworld, which becomes known as Hel. It's actually Niflhel. She is given charge of the 9th world, the world of the dead. And it was her job to provide the dead with all they needed. Her hall is called Elhudnir, and it means sprayed with sleet and snow. So it's always got a storm cloud over it. It's always hailing and storming on it. The hall threshold is called Stumbling Block. The roof drips poison.
Yikes.
And it's made of woven serpents. Her dish is called Hunger. Her knife is called Famine. And her bed is called Sick Bed.
Wow.
Yeah. So everything's pretty grim. So when Balder was killed, Hel made him welcome in her hall. And the poem Balder's Dream tells us that she decked the halls with arm rings and strewed the dais with gold to welcome him. Mead was brewed, and Balder's brother rode to Hel and begged to get him back. But Hel said she would only let him go if all the things in the world, alive or dead, wept for him. And only one Jotun woman refused to weep, saying, "Let Hel keep what she has." And of course, there is some belief that this Jotun woman might have been Loki in disguise. We don't know for sure. But Gylfaginning, the poem Gylfaginning, tells us that Loki will lead all of Hel's people against the Aesir in Ragnarok. So that's Hel for you.
No wonder nobody wants to go there.
And there's a lot of references to Hel as a place. So they talk about the Hel Road, which leads to Hel, and they talk about tying on their Hel shoes, which protect the dead's feet when they're walking to Hel, if they have to walk. Not everybody has to walk. A lot of people go by boat, hence the ship burials, or they go by chariot. Many, especially vulvas, were buried in wagon beds or in ships, or in boats. So, and we have a lot of, they're usually buried with grave goods that indicate their vulvas, like a wand and various magical things. So we're pretty sure they went to Hel, the Volur.
Well, it's a pretty grim hall, but Odin's hall in Valhalla isn't a whole lot better. Like the benches are lined. Either there's both either chainmail or just straw or whatever, but one I read was chainmail. It's spears and there's that giant eagle that sits at the threshold. I mean, Valhalla didn't seem a whole lot better.
What's interesting is that the hall at Bjorka was the warriors' hall. The walls were embedded with weapons, and so was the roof. And so it almost sounds like it was a replica of Valhalla.
Oh, neat.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Clearly they couldn't imagine much in creature comforts for their dead.
No. Although actually on the Oseberg burial ship, the dead were laid in a very comfortable bed with a down mattress and a down comforter. They had all the comforts of home. These were women, and they were but also actually the Gokstad ship too. So if they were royal, the dead were buried very comfortably with mattresses and things.
Maybe that's why some of the dead maybe stayed in their burial mounds.
Well, and that's what the hope was. Make it so nice for you that you won't leave.
Yeah. Okay. So now we have the goddess Idun. She was in charge. She's an Aesir god, and she was the woman in charge of the fruit that kept the gods and goddesses immortal and kept them from aging. She kept these magical apples in a box made out of ash wood, and she carries the box with her. So Idun was married to Bragi, the god of poetry. Bragi was very wise and had the gift of poetry and storytelling. Our English words brag and braggart probably come from the Norse word bragger.
No doubt.
Which is a person skilled with words. In the Norse world, though, being a bragger would have been a tremendous compliment, not like now when being a braggart is a bad thing. And a bragger was actually considered a really great thing. It was highly skilled to have a way with words.
Well, they actually called a drink the bragger cup.
That's right.
Yes, and that was something that you drank before you made your vows.
And of course, Loki insulted her.
Naturally.
Yeah. And then in one story, the Skaldskaparmal, the apples of immortality are stolen.
Of course.
And the god behind this treachery?
Yes.
Loki.
Oh, Loki.
So the story begins with Odin, Loki, and another god, Hymir, traveling through the world, and they become hungry. So the gods do get hungry. They spied a herd of oxen, captured one, and then they tried to cook it on the fire. Nothing happened. The meat stayed raw. They tried again. Nothing happened, and they grew frustrated. So a giant eagle spoke to them from a nearby tree. He said he could cook the meat for them, and they agreed.
They should have known better.
I don't know why they didn't think twice about this. Yes, you're right. They should have known better. So when the eagle swooped down to help them, he helped himself to huge portions of the ox. Loki wasn't pleased, so he picked up a stick. I mean, he's a god. They have some magical abilities. He picks up a stick and beats the eagle with it. It makes me think of that scene in The Empire Strikes Back when R2-D2 tries to take the flashlight from Yoda, and Yoda just bangs on him with a stick. So, unfortunately for Loki, the eagle took off flying while he was still hanging onto the stick.
And of course, he couldn't let go.
No, he didn't just let go. And then the eagle flew low and like kind of dragged him over rough terrain, just banging him around until Loki begged for mercy.
Couldn't happen to a nicer god.
It's a pretty funny picture.
Mm-hmm.
So in exchange for his life, the eagle demanded that Loki swear an oath that he would lure Idun and her apples of immortality out of Asgard. And, rather than be killed, Loki agreed.
Of course he did.
This eagle was really a jotun named Thiazi.
Yes, of course he was.
Yes. And for a jotun to gain access to the apples of immortality, it'd be catastrophic for all the Aesir.
Mm-hmm.
So Loki managed to lure Idun out of Asgard by telling her he'd found some amazing apples and he wanted to show them to her. And then for her to bring her apples so they could compare them. Poor Idun. She trusted him. Why anybody trusted Loki is beyond
Well, I don't think Idun was the smartest woman in the world.
Maybe. Hopefully she learned. So once they got outside the walls of Asgard, Thiazi appeared in his eagle form and he snatched up Idun and her box of apples. Now, once deprived of their apples, the Aesir and the gods and the goddesses all grew old, and they knew that if this kept up, they would soon die, or whatever happened to gods when they die, wither, turn into dust, who knows. So they threatened Loki with all kinds of bodily harm if he didn't fix things. I mean, he was the one who caused it. He was the last person seen with Idun, and he was to blame. First, Loki needed to borrow Freya's falcon cloak so he could fly into Jotunheim.
And this is how we know about it.
Yes. And luckily for him, he found Idun unguarded. So he transformed her into a nut so he could carry her in his talons. And in that way, he flew out of Jotunheim with Idun. But soon, what? And the apples. Yes. And soon Thiazi discovered Idun's disappearance and he transformed into his eagle form so he could chase after Loki in his falcon cloak. Once the other Aesir gods saw what was happening, they built a fire at the base of the walls of Asgard. And then once Loki was over the wall with Idun, the gods lit the fire. I imagine it was like this huge blaze. Mm-hmm. And Thiazi was flying too fast, couldn't avoid it, and his feathers caught fire. He fell from the sky and the Aesir killed him. So with the apples back, the goddess and goddesses stopped aging and all was well again. And that's really all we hear from Idun. But I like to think that she became a little more savvy and didn't trust Loki in the future.
Well, probably not, because there are no more stories about her, so she didn't do like that again anyway.
I like that little bit that the gods have to eat this apple to stay immortal. Yes. I like that they have a weakness. So every powerful being needs some kind of weakness, and that's theirs.
Yeah.
And finally, we come to Skadi, the snowshoe goddess. She is Thiazi's daughter. That's how we know her. And, it should come as no surprise that the Norse people had a deity they called the snowshoe goddess, being snowy and a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. And she, like I said, she's the Jotun and the daughter of Thiazi. And she's most often depicted on skis with a bow in her hands as she hunts. And she loves her mountain hall of Thrymheim, which means thunder home.
I love that.
I do too. And her name basically means scathe. And that's where we get our English word. Okay. So Skadi is no pushover.
No, she's not.
And I've also read that her name could be connected to the name of Scandinavia, although it's unclear whether the name came from her or if it was like a retroactive. I don't know, but it's just something I read. Cool. So she has a complicated relationship with the Aesir gods because she's the daughter of Thiazi, and the gods killed him, she has to then revenge her father's death. Killing a loved one didn't go unchallenged in the Norse world, as we both know. So she put on her helmet and coat of mail and took all of her weapons of war and set out for Asgard to avenge her father.
And that's interesting that they have a female doing this, taking vengeance.
Yes. All her weapons of war. And I was like, oh, what did she have? Like a sword and a spear? And like, what did she have?
Exactly.
And she must have been pretty formidable because she was outnumbered. And they had the Aesir gods had Thor on their side, but they still determined they would reconcile with her instead. They offered that she could marry one of them, but could only choose by looking at their feet. This is just another one of those weird mythology stories. So the gods stood behind a curtain with only their feet showing. And being clever, Skadi made the reasonable choice and picked the one with the cleanest, most attractive feet, with the assumption it was the beautiful god Balder. And I'm not sure why Balder was even behind the curtain because he had a wife.
Well, maybe he didn't at this time.
I guess it could. I guess he could have been
the timeline here.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that kind of stuff's all mixed up. But unfortunately for Skadi, it was not Balder. Those lovely feet belonged to the sea god Njord. So I guess being a sea god has benefits. You can have clean feet.
Nice toenails.
Yeah. And apparently Njord was very rich. So that had its benefits. But before she would leave Asgard with her new husband, Skadi had one more condition for the Aesir. They had to make her laugh.
And this thing to do.
And this is where it gets weird. To make Skadi laugh, Loki fetched a rope and a billy goat. He tied one end of the rope to the goat's beard and one end to his own testicles.
This is very Viking.
Yeah, you're right. And they proceeded to have a tug of war. Because apparently, if you want to make a vengeful Jotun laugh, this is how you do it.
Probably the only way.
So they tugged and they were both squealing in pain until Loki fell into Skadi's lap. She laughed and all was well. And then Odin, in what I like to consider a rare bit of decency, threw her father, Thiazi's eyes into the sky where they became two stars.
Well, you know what's kind of interesting about this story is that it really models the Scandinavian belief in, either fighting to the death to get vengeance or taking weregild. So this is the weregild that she demanded. And it definitely shows that a daughter could demand weregild as well as a son.
Oh, yeah. And the custom of two opposing factions marrying.
Yes, as a way to make peace.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, though, Skadi and Njord did not have a happy marriage. He was a sea god and she was a Jotun of the snow and the mountains. They did give it a try. Njord lived in his hall by the sea, and Skadi lived in Thrymheim. And Thrymheim was located in the high mountains and in the deep forest. So they agreed to live in Thrymheim for 9 nights in his hall. I don't know how to say this. Noatun.
That's probably
good. 3 nights. And after the 9 nights were over, Njord had had enough of the cold, snowy stronghold where wolves howled. He says, hateful to me are the mountains. I was not long there, only 9 nights. The howling of the wolves sounded ugly to me after the song of swans. Next, they tried Njord's hall by the sea, and this time Skadi was the unhappy partner. Sleep I could not on the seabeds for the screeching of the birds. That gull wakes me woken from the wide sea he comes each morning. And I've lived near the beach before, and seagulls are noisy.
They are.
They really are. I've never lived where there's wolves, so I don't know, but I know seagulls are loud. So it seemed like they just could not agree on a marital abode. So Skadi and Njord decided to live separately. He in his place by the sea, and she in her mountain fortress, and they never lived together again. Which I thought was a pretty reasonable solution for the Norse gods.
They could have gotten divorced, but they didn't.
Yeah.
They stayed married.
And she became incorporated into the family of the Aesir, even treating Njord's children, Freyr and Freya, as if they were her own. And once again, we return back to the Lokasenna with Skadi insulted by Loki. He claims that she begged him to sleep with him. But she gets her revenge on Loki, though. When
Yes,
she's the one who dangled that serpent that dripped venom into his face. It just goes to show that no one can shame that bow hunting, wolf hunting Jotun. At least not get away with it. Not even Loki.
Yeah, she's a great character.
I love Skadi. And I love the images I've seen of her where she's riding down a mountain on her skis with a bow in her hands. It's neat.
And apparently in wintertime, hunting with a bow and arrow on skis was a very common way of hunting. And also they often used a spear, and they had one ski that was longer than the other.
Oh.
And so this shorter ski had a hide on the rough side of a hide, glued to the bottom of it, so that it was used as a kicker.
Oh.
So in other words, they glided on one ski, on the long ski, and they kicked off, they propelled themselves with the shorter ski. And then they used a spear for a ski pole to help balance themselves. So it's a totally different way of skiing than what we're familiar with.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I get why they would hunt on skis, because the snow would have been thick and hard to walk through. Yeah. Oh, I hadn't heard about the two different length skis. That's interesting.
Yeah, it is. I did a whole study on that at one point, and I was really fascinated by that. So because they've actually apparently found skis like this.
Neat. All right, you have anything else?
I don't think so. We got a lot more to cover, but that'll have to wait till next time.
Yeah. All right. All right. So that wraps up part 1 of our series about Norse goddesses. And we're going to continue next month with part 2, because there are many more to talk about.
Yes, there are.
All right. Well, see you next time.
Okay.
Bye. Thanks for listening. You can find Johanna at johannawittenberg.com, where you'll find a free short story, a prequel to her Norse Queen series. And you can find me, K.S., at ksbarton.com, where you can also find a free short story from me, a prequel to my Norse family series. See you next time.